Do you want I was waiting for a thumb up from our technical man, which is not a Trumpian thumb up. But nevertheless, that is the motif for today's meeting. Davos Man lands in Trumpworld. It's been a week or fortnight, really, of a great deal of talk. Of course, that's what the World Economic Forum is there for, talk. But also with talk from President Trump in his inauguration speech that the time for empty talk is over. This is the hour for action. Words which were, of course, followed with a great deal more talk from the President, both live and on Twitter. And what we will be doing today is trying to make sense of what it is we've learned over this period, this fortnight especially, but really over the last 2 months, about what is taken to be the shaking of the global liberal order. What does this really amount to? What are the actions that we are seeing amounting to? And what sort of role do we see both America and China in particular playing in this future? So the panel here is carefully selected, of course, for that task. Rana, professor of the history and politics of modern China and director of the Oxford China Center. Samantha Peltz, American, master of public policy student here at Blavatnik. Wolfgang Munchau, columnist at the Financial Times and very much a specialist on Europe and the Euro. And your own Karthik Ramanna, professor of business and public policy here at Blavatnik. So we're going to start, as always, with brisk takeouts from each of the panelists about how they see things, and then I'll lead a discussion. I'm going to start with China, the new champion of globalization.
Champion of globalization and liberal values, possibly, as well. Who knows? Well, that might be a bit too much to expect. Thank you, Bill. Well, I think I'll just point out 2 or 3 of the events in the really astonishingly fast-moving last few days that suggests that both in terms of Trump's words and Xi Jinping's words and their relative silence, that we're seeing, at least in some very important areas, a significant turn in terms of the way in which order, not just in Asia, but actually more globally, and I'll explain briefly in a second why I say more globally, is going to be shifting in the next few months and years. So the first most obvious one that people have talked about is the statement by Trump that he's dumping the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, I think probably most people here know enough about it. I imagine this has probably got the highest per capita readership of the Financial Times of any area possibly in the southeast of England, with the exception possibly of the City of London. So I'm sure reading Wolfgang's articles and Gideon Rachman and many other commentators on these subjects, you'll know that the basic outline of why this is an extraordinary act by Trump after many of the US's Asian allies expended a great deal of political capital and time in putting a new free trade framework forward in the region. But the point I want to make about order is about Malcolm Turnbull's reaction, about the reaction, and also Bill English, the Prime Ministers of Australia and New Zealand, coming up with an instant response that maybe it was time to get the Chinese on board in terms of a new form of TPP. Now, let's separate the words from the reality. Those who've looked at it will know that the conditions that are demanded of anyone taking part in the TPP as it's now formulated are actually pretty demanding in a whole variety of areas. I'm thinking workers' rights, for instance. Actually, I'm not sure that China would qualify under the current system. And that's one of the reasons why their alternative RCEP, Regional Common Economic Partnership, structure has also been doing the rounds. The point is not about the substance. The point is about the symbolism. If you're now living in a world, want to call it Trump world, that's fine, in which the United States pulls out of a major stabilizing framework, not just in economic terms, but actually in terms of the security implications for the region, and instead leads the leaders, the prime ministers of 2 major Western-oriented liberal states, Australia and New Zealand, to at least talk about China as an obvious power to fill the gap, then you are living in a very different conception of what the regional and global framework in the Asia-Pacific and beyond is going to be. Let's link that to another issue which astonishingly hasn't yet blown up, if that's the right phrase, in the last few days, partly because I think the president clearly is going through a very long list and he's been concentrating more on the Mexican wall and other issues in the last couple of days. But I'm sure he's going to get to climate change. I believe that, well, Sam, I believe, has experienced the energy world, so she may say more about this. But again, if it turns out that there's going to be a ripping up of the US involvement in what was agreed in Paris on climate change, this will inevitably give the Chinese a chance to lead. And on this one issue, at least, they will have the European Union, they will have India, they will have a newly separated UK, almost certainly behind them. It seems to me at the moment inconceivable that a unilateralist position by the United States on the climate change agreement will be followed by any very large constellation of other powers. And that, of course, changes the framework. The third point related to this comes from the president's statement last night, in which, and again, someone else will have the exact phrasing, but something like torture can be useful. Quite apart from the astonishing novelty, if that's the most neutral word I can find, of such a statement being made by the President of the United States, it's a step away from, if you remember, 10, 12 years ago, figures in the Bush administration talked about enhanced interrogation, at the time rightly picked up as weasel words. But it's often said that hypocrisy is the tip of the hat that virtue pays to vice. At least in a system where understandings post-1945 of human rights, of individual and civil rights, are such that even if you're practicing things that are beyond the pale, you have to at least pretend to the world that you're not doing that. Moving from that to a world where the most powerful figure in the free world can openly say that torture is actually maybe sometimes a good idea, not only opens up the whole arena of what we thought we knew about the direction of civil and individual rights, but also, of course, enables leaders of other countries which perhaps traditionally have not been so squeamish about enhanced interrogation or their own version of that, to say, well, the United States president thinks it's great, so actually, really, why do you have a problem with what we do in this country in Asia, in that country in Eastern Europe, in this other country in Africa? And finally, I'll just pick up, in a sense, it's a version of the point about the TPP, but it's also about our own status here in the UK. As we move on out of the European Union, it would appear. I enjoyed Wolfgang's editorial in the FT, I think earlier this week, very much, in which he said that people who think that Brexit won't, Britain will stay in the single market and that Trump is a reality show you can turn off are in for a rude surprise. Well, I think Britain's trade negotiators are in for a series of quite rude surprises. One, if they think that a trade agreement with the US will be smooth and easy. And second, if they think that setting one up with China, another country which has been spoken of often as a potential new partner, is going to be simple either. So the question of how far China is able to control those agendas, I think, is really going to be an important part of our thinking in certainly the next year and beyond that. But the 3 or 4 points I've made, I think, are where the weaknesses in the liberal world's position now exist, if indeed it is still a liberal world, and where, if I were Xi Jinping, I would be seeking to push very hard to turn the wheel in my direction.
Excellent. Well, we'll explore a bit further the way that the wheel might turn in Xi Jinping's direction in a moment. Now, Sam, I'm going to go to you as our American student, although Karthik, of course, is also an American citizen. What has struck you in the first week of this new administration in terms of actions?
I think that was a great sort of overview globally. I'm going to drill a little bit further down into the sort of what's going on in the first week. You know, he's as of this morning issued 12 executive orders over the last 3 days, and you know it could we could be missing it right now. But you know we're still only 3/5 of the way through the week, so who knows what will happen. But I think a little bit of making sense of this is, you know, Trump entered office with the lowest approval ratings of any presidential elect in the last 20 years. Attendance numbers at his inauguration were roughly the third of either of Obama's. And so he's had to do some domestic damage control this week. And I think that's what these executive orders are about. So he's mostly, I think, dealing with two members of two factions that he needs to contend with. And the first is the Republican Party, where it's no secret that they've made no secret throughout the election that they're not the biggest fans. And he really needs the congressional Republicans to be on his side in order to move forward with a lot of the mandate that he wants to accomplish. The other is his supporters. I think social media has been a light since the election, with his supporters being overwhelmingly disappointed in both the appointments that he's made and his backing down from some of his campaign promises, including prosecuting Hillary Clinton, I think is a big one that we've heard about. And so I think that these executive orders largely are pandering to those two groups. So, we saw in the first 2 days a lot of sort of traditional Republican agenda items, the first being the rollback of the Affordable Care Act. They had the regulatory freeze, which is also a move that Bush did on the first day of his presidency. Another Bush move was the abortion gag rule, where U.S.-based nonprofits who are operating in foreign countries cannot offer abortion as a potential alternative. So that's also something that Bush did. TPP, as you mentioned, I don't think I can speak to that as eloquently as you, so I'll not even try. And then the pipelines, the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone Pipeline, reviving both those projects are sort of GOP pandering moves I see. And then to the supporters, he issued an executive order encouraging that there be American steel used in pipelines, which is one of his big campaign promises to revive the American manufacturing sector. He spoke yesterday about deportation, stepping those up, as well as hiring an additional 10,000 people to work on immigration on ICE. The border wall is one that has no shortage of news coverage. And then, of course, investigating voter fraud, which both parties have said was not an issue, and yet he is going to go ahead with looking at that. So those are sort of the two camps that I see him really looking towards this week. And I think some of the implications we saw from the Economist, there was I believe it's the Democracy Report, you know better, but the U.S. has officially been downgraded from a full democracy to a flawed one. Which we're in good company. There's 45% of the world is in that category. But that's something that we've seen directly impacting. And I think the effects, that's more of an indicator. The effects that will have is, as you said, sort of the U.S. there's a bit of a void, and respect will kind of decrease for U.S. diplomatic relations globally. I think a lot of these actions are sort of the beginning of that, and we've already seen some indicators that will continue. So that's sort of the outlook that I have. Maybe a bit bleak, but
it's only week one. Come on, it's going to be great. Now, Wolfgang, how does it look from your seat in?
From my seat in Oxford.
In Oxford and in the Financial Times, and looking at it from a European point of view.
Right, yes. I mean, I suspect, if I look back at the last year, and one of the things we said at the time, and given the way the polls looked on Brexit in the United States and the primaries in those days, we said at one point the populists will gain a victory. We didn't predict where it would be, but it would be very unlikely that the liberal establishment views would prevail in all the referendums that were coming and in all the elections that were coming. This is just statistically highly improbable given how close the populist positions and the liberal positions were in the polls. And obviously we had a couple of setbacks last year, big setbacks last year that, people, I remember back in May we said, what people were asking, would you rather have Trump or would you rather have Brexit? It was like a sort of titillating questions like, oh, it's not going to happen, but let's just, think the impossible. And, and then obviously as a European, we were interested in the Italian referendum because that's a very, very important story for us in Europe because that could seriously the outcome of it and the consequences of that, which I will not discuss here now, but it could seriously upset the Eurozone over the next 2 years. So three big things went wrong. I don't expect everything to go wrong this year. It's very unlikely that that it'll continue like this. I think the French will probably be counter cyclical in this respect. But I don't know. Le Pen is a serious candidate. Don't get me wrong that I'm predicting anything. It's just not including or excluding anything. I don't think the populists will win in Germany in any significant way, but they will be presented. What shocked me over the last year was not so much the fact that there were a few victories, more than even I expected. What shocked me was the reaction of the liberal establishment, like pretty much all of us essentially here, and people in government, people in the newspapers and the media. It was pretty much, I would characterize it as a period of wishful thinking. The polls were closed in the Brexit campaign. Some polls had the Brexiteers ahead, but it was a shock when it happened. And then the same people, were absolutely certain. There was this one American professor who gave a 99% probability that Hillary Clinton would win the U.S. elections. And there was so much certainty around that. Is the same in the Italian referendum, when the polls had already predicted very clear victory of the no vote. It was still seen to be a cliffhanger vote, and I mean it is an interesting phenomenon. And every time you see an upset, the establishment view was to seek refuge in some comforting thought. When Brexit happened, it was the EU would now consolidate and Britain would be isolated. It would be a really bad thing for Britain, and the economy would collapse. When Trump won, the consoling thought was that Angela Merkel would be the global leader, which is silly, because a country with a 9% current account surplus cannot be a global leader. It's just an impossibility. Germany is not even is not really a leader of Europe. I mean, she is the most experienced member of the European Council and thus carries a great weight and influence. But she cannot lead Europe. In the end, the Eurozone's lack of resolution, the lack of economic reforms, the lack of political reforms in the Eurozone, the lack of banking resolution, is all to do with the fact that people have failed to take the necessary steps, have acted in their national interest, and Germany is no exception. Germany has very much acted in its national interest and not in the overriding Eurozone interest in the way it behaved in the last six to 8 years. It is ridiculous that Germany is the global leader. It is just as ridiculous as what was said in Davos, that China is going to be the leader. I mean, China is a country with a massive current account surplus. It's with massive internal economic imbalances. And we have to see how these imbalances, some of the greatest imbalances we've seen in economic history. We'll have to see how these will be resolved, whether it's going to be resolved in some kind of a violent adjustment or a smooth adjustment. I'd want to see that first before predicting that China is going to be the leader of the free world and the champion of globalization. And I think, as Bill knows better than anyone, the kind of stuff we used to say in the 1980s about Japan. And the new world leader, and people made these incredible extrapolations based on a property bubble, and then obviously we know what happened. So I think the world is pretty much as it was. America is going more into. We are not prepared. The real scandal is not that Trump doesn't like the EU or likes the EU to stabilize. The real scandal is that the EU has allowed itself to be in that position. The EU could have increased its defense spending. That's what we should be criticizing, rather than hyperventilating about Trump. I mean, I don't agree with anything he's done in the last week, but I think our response should not be to hyperventilate. Our response should be to actually say, what can we do to prevent this dissatisfaction? And there's quite a number of things we should do. We should fortify our defenses. We should certainly stabilize in Europe, stabilize the Eurozone. And that means, ensuring measures of political union, fiscal union, they need to be done, or we need to break it up. But we'll not, this current state of affairs, a monetary union, an unstable monetary union without fiscal union will break up by itself unless something is done. And we should also, I would warn against anyone who thinks that we should try to penalize Britain in the EU. There's still people who think that is a viable outcome. I think Britain and the EU will need each other for this not to end in disaster. So I would wish and hope for a friendly settlement. I see the danger of that not happening. So I think at the moment, my concern is not that fact that another populist might win and what Trump might do next tomorrow. My concern is that we are not drawing the right consequences from what we saw in the last year.
Splendid. No, I think that's very well made, and it's certainly true that point you make that the liberal establishment, if we may call each other that, principal reaction to these shocks was to say that either the voters must be ignorant and somehow badly informed, or we must try harder to improve our arguments, not that we should do something different. And that distinction is a very important one, and we'll come on to some of these European questions in a moment, I think. Now, Karthik, how does it look to you as a business professor, maybe talking to the billionaires who are in the now running America?
Right. So let me offer a little more optimistic picture of the world to come, and maybe we can take it from there. So, I think there's been no shortage of evidence that has surfaced in the last 5 to 8 years, particularly since the financial crisis, that there's something structurally wrong with capitalism. And what we've seen that happen over the last year is, in some sense, democracy reining capitalism, or a capitalism that has run amok, back in. And eventually, in a democratic society, you'd want that to happen. You'd want capitalism to serve democracy and not the other way around. So a more favorable perspective on the developments of 2016 in terms of both Brexit and the rise of Trump is that it is simply a way in which you'd want the system to work. You'd want populism, and you'd want the democratic consensus to rein in capitalism when it oversteps its mandate. So there's been at least 4 major concerns with capitalism that have emerged in part due to, the change in the returns to labor, particularly as that's viewed across the distribution of human endowments. So we're all endowed differently with abilities and skills, and the returns to labor across that distribution have skewed increasingly to the right over the last 50 years. And there are many reasons for that, at least 4 of which might be salient in understanding what's happened now. The first, of course, is technological progress. Now, this is something we've been concerned about since the Industrial Revolution, but in particular with the digital age, with the internet economy, technological progress has played a pretty remarkable role in sort of skewing the returns to labor at the far end of the skills spectrum very convexly. So that's something that we have to acknowledge. But the second thing that is implicated here is globalization. And the rush to find sort of the lowest cost market in terms of the labor supply, and that has had an impact on the returns to labor, particularly in rich countries. The third thing that matters here, and this is salient to the rise of Trump and also Brexit, is immigration. In the U.S., that is largely illegal immigration, because low-skilled immigration, legal low-skilled immigration is hard to accomplish in the U.S. But so you have a lot of low-skilled illegal immigration in the U.S., and that plays an important role in driving down returns to labor in rich countries. And in the UK, in part due to the European Union and the freedom of travel, you've had a lot of low-skill immigration here that's legal, but it's immigration nonetheless. And so that's a third concern. And then the fourth is what I'll call structural corruption, which you can think about, in terms of, say, a particularly skewed tax system that benefits the wealthy. President Trump himself seems not to have paid a large sum in taxes over the last 20 years. And so there is some concern that there's sort of a different set of rules for the very wealthy versus for everyone else. And the so-called liberal establishment that we've spoken about today has, in fact, co-opted a lot of the winners in this changing returns distribution to labor into its own ranks, in part because the liberal elite tends to be champions of meritocracy. So if you do very well for yourself, then welcome to the club. So, you've had these sort of structural issues with capitalism over the last 20 or 30 years. Some of these actually go far back, longer than that. And eventually you see, the democratic process working as it should and reining those in. So one more optimistic view of the world is that with these changes, you might start to see some of these issues being addressed. Now, that being said, obviously, the devil is in the details, and some of the panelists have raised very valid objections to Trump's immediate priorities. But I still, nonetheless, as of now, remain optimistic for the future, particularly for 2017.
Excellent. Okay, that's a very good tone. Now let's open up to discussion. I'm going to lead with two or three questions, and then we'll open up to the hall. I'm going to start with you, Karthik. I mean, if you were sitting in that room with President Trump, you are the leader of a major global American business.
Yeah.
Probably at least half of your sales are outside the United States.
Yeah.
In many of the cases of those around those tables that we've seen on television this week.
You're the Secretary of State.
And in one case, you're the Secretary of State. And clearly you will probably come in with some of the sense of optimism about some of the pro-business policies. How do you think about the public policy issues that are being talked about and floated to you? How do you react to notions of a 35% tariff on China or a border tax adjustment and these things?
Right.
How would you form your strategy?
Right. So let me say that I'm under no illusion that a businessman, billionaire who is addressing Trump would in fact adopt a pro-market view in his or her approach. In fact, what this businessman would adopt is what I would call a pro-business view, and in particular a view that protects his or her own business, which is not always the same as what protects markets as a whole. So if the question is what would that businessman ask for, I think unqualifiably the businessman would ask for lower taxes. And I think that that's something that Trump will deliver on with great gusto. He himself will benefit from that. So I think that that's what the businessman will ask for. But I think the broader question here is what can Trump do that works for the economy as a whole? And here I think there are some serious concerns with the hollowing out of the American middle class. And the American middle class is the great consumer engine that keeps the global economy thriving. And you don't want a hollowing out of the American middle class even if you are a billionaire businessman, because that's whom you sell everything to. Now, at some point, maybe the Chinese middle class or the Indian middle class will play an important role, but as of now, it is the American middle class that matters. And so Trump's efforts in stemming, sort of the unchecked immigration, particularly illegal immigration in the United States, which drives down wages in particularly inner city areas where illegal immigrants might take jobs that otherwise American citizens who don't have access to wide range of economic opportunities would seek. So I would actually put some pressure on Trump to continue his agenda on focusing on providing economic opportunities for those parts, the hollowed out Rust Belt of America, those parts of the United States that since 1988 voted quite reliably Democratic, in some cases by as much as 20% margins, and then in this election flipped over and voted for Trump. The swings in some of these districts are as high as 27% from Obama in 2012 to Trump now. So I would urge Trump not to lose sight of that mandate and to focus on policies that provide for economic opportunities in those communities.
Now, Rana, if you're looking at how this future might play out, I would urge you not. I think following your instincts, I would not think about economics too much. I would think about politics, because in my view, politics is where the discontinuities and the sometimes unpredictable things can happen. Economics kind of evolves in a more organic way. What's the Chinese reaction to a 35% tariff, or anyway, a piece of aggressive trade protection legislation or declaration coming up, if that is true, from Wilbur Ross, Peter Navarro, Bob Lighthizer, and
Death by China.
President Trump.
Indeed.
Death by China. How does the Chinese politics of that play through?
I think if that were to happen, it would probably be a great gift to Xi Jinping politically, for a variety of reasons. He has a choice then of doing either sort of taking a high road or a low road or a combination of them all to try and, in the medium term, do what I think he wants to do, which is to raise the idea in the global community of China as being a more stable, responsible, reliable power in the global system. Let me just expand that point for 2 seconds to also respond to something that Wolfgang said before we just get to the point about the tariff. I mean, I absolutely agree with you, and I think anyone who looks at the numbers and the level of power projection in the world would say that there is no substitute in the near future for the United States. Malcolm Rifkin put it accurately, although not entirely elegantly, the other day. He said that if China wants to be a superpower, well, the United States is a super-duper power, which is probably about right. So even under Trump or any other president, there's no doubt that in terms of the influence, projection, and role in the world economy that America has, China, the EU, or any other actor couldn't possibly hope to emulate that in any direct sense. But if the direction that we see Trump going in continues, then it does open up opportunities for different sorts of aspects of leadership. One of the things that was very notable about the change in in global perceptions during the presidency of George W. Bush was that because he and his administration rather explicitly projected themselves as projecting a unilateral view of American values and American power, it coincided, as we now know, it wasn't obvious at the time, but now it's obvious that it coincided with the decade or part of the decade when China was posting double-digit growth and able to actually project its own vision of what it wanted to do, at least in the immediate region, in a context in which America looked like the outlier. The Obama administration, which was more mainstream in terms of its foreign policy, didn't allow China, almost by default, to do that, and the pivot to Asia that happened helped in that. So China's actions, particularly partly through its more assertive and aggressive actions in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and so forth, I think didn't help its own cause in that particular case. I do think there's a possibility for a pivot, again, at this stage, but a pivot that at least allows the impression, the image, the influence of China to increase during this period. And a very sharp trade war emerging would actually, I think, in the short to medium term, give China lots and lots of platforms on which to make a case for its own virtue. One would be in the World Trade Organization. I mean, there are still many people who have questions about the circumstances in which China entered the WTO in 2001, but it's a decade and a half ago it's done, and it's part of our architecture now. Certainly, China would be able to project itself as, if not exactly a champion of universal free trade, at least someone on the side, relatively the angels, in the face of a very strongly protectionist policy by the United States, even if the actual effects, I think, wouldn't necessarily be all that immediately felt. They might be symbolic as much as anything else. There are a whole variety of also other areas where China, I think, would choose to stress aspects of its own medium-term strategy, the One Belt, One Road policy, which is still very much language rather than reality, but is promising, at least, claiming that in the next decade and a half, it would spread $1 trillion worth of infrastructure spending throughout the greater Southeast Asia to Central Asia region. Now, again, the prospect of China actually doing this, I think, is pretty limited in many ways. But I think we're going through a time, I mean, if you don't believe that rhetoric matters, then you actually probably don't believe that President Trump matters very much, because one thing that he's very, very keen on is clearly using language to create an alternative sort of reality. And I think this does give the opportunity for China to use particularly protectionism and tariffs as a means to portray itself as being more in the global mainstream on economics and on security and on politics, even when on a whole variety of issues it clearly isn't.
Now, a brisk political science question to you, Sam, really, essentially, on the Republican Party, I'm sure about which you are intimately connected, or with which you're intimately connected.
Okay.
Thinking in incentives, I mean, basically what you've got is a Republican majority in Congress.
Mm-hmm.
You've got midterm elections in 2 years' time.
Yep.
You've had, obviously, you've got a powerful new president there. If you are thinking as Republicans in Congress,
Yep.
what balance of interest do you think about, and what could change your view one way or the other between going with the grain of President Trump or going against him? In other words, controlling him and running in 2 years' time as a non-Trump party. How might that play out is really what I'm wondering.
Well, a couple things there. I think it's a tough question in that it requires a little bit of looking into the crystal ball.
Absolutely,
which,
it's unfair.
we love to do, so I'll do it. But I think I want to come at this question a little bit sideways and respond to something that Karthik said. He said that, the liberal establishment has among its ranks a lot of the winners of the sort of recent economic change, which is something that I wholeheartedly agree with. But I think it's worth a little bit of breaking down who those winners are and who are among the winners in the GOP ranks, which I think also they have. So it seems to me that a lot of the Silicon Valley and the sort of new technology innovation have been wrapped up in the ranks of the liberal establishment, as well as a good portion of the establishment media, which is why we see a lot of coverage on that. And then I think sort of on the other side, the GOP's winners are more of an old guard. And, coming from the energy sector, we see a lot of, I think Rex Tillerson is the poster child for the old guard winners of the GOP. And so I think that to the extent that Trump, in terms of business policy, and Karthik, maybe you can speak more on this, but to the extent that he is sort of seeking to roll back some of the economic progress that's been made and favor some maybe more old guard winners, I feel that is a strategy that will ultimately fail. And if he doesn't sort of figure out how to get the innovators on board, that will be a big problem for him. And maybe you can say more about that. But to answer your question, I think considering some of these old guard winners that are among the ranks of the GOP, I think the congressional Republicans are largely on their heels at this point to wait and see. So I think that the actions of this week are part of a campaign to convince them to come on board. Whether that will be successful remains largely to be seen. I think they're going to look at his approval ratings and what that will do for the election in 2018. But also, I read a really interesting article this morning. The Democrats put out yesterday a $1 trillion infrastructure plan. And there was a lot of criticism from the liberal establishment media that they would do this because there's a theory that Trump's low approval ratings are correlated with their electoral success in 2018, so that they should try and leave his approval ratings as low as possible so that they can come in 2018. I think that's an interesting strategy. Will the Democrats cooperate with Trump and potentially contribute to his success and maybe his reelection? It seems like that's what they're looking to do with this new transportation plan. I think the Republicans will try to squeeze as much policy progress in their minds as they can out of the majority. But how much they align themselves with Trump is something that we don't yet know. I will say also that during the hearings, a lot of those nominees spent a lot of time distancing themselves from a lot of the things that Trump said. So to the extent that that's sort of a proxy, that might be the case.
Great. Okay. Well, let's. I want to invite anyone in the room for questions. I'm saving one up for Wolfgang about Penelope Fillon and the sudden the bomb of the 100-year-old non-mainstream media in France that has now been the canard enchaîné that has now been placed under what seemed like, if you like, the hope of the moderate right in France. But let me get anyone here who would like to make a contribution, ask a question. Come on.
I'm stunned by your insights.
Who would like to begin? Sir, yeah, here we are, microphone coming.
So the comments so far are from people standing and sitting on the sidelines looking at what's playing out between Trump and China. You made the real key point for me, which is the liberal elite have blamed the ignorance of the hoi polloi, if you like, or whatever, or need to make the arguments better. But what they haven't done is said they need to do something different. So what do you think they could do different to reverse the situation?
Well, let's, Wolfgang, say a few words more about that. I mean, that was really your point, that the European Union is all very well explaining itself better. It has to do something.
Apart from the European Union, if you look at the West in general, I mean, much of the problems we are in are the result of an economic model we adopted in the late 1980s. It has its theoretical foundations in the New Keynesian paradigm, which followed by a very concrete policy and institutional proposals like independent central banking. That wasn't common until the late 1990s. It became common not until then. The argument was monetary policy shouldn't is long term. It shouldn't, or medium term. It shouldn't. Politicians shouldn't interfere with it. But since the 90s, the argument was there are actually theoretical foundations because there is the optimal a low inflation rate is consistent with high employment. Therefore, we can leave it to technicians. That argument, I think, is wrong and refuted. And I think we could probably rethink some of the structures we created. And I think fiscal rules, independent central banks, a monetary union, the way in Europe we have it on, it was very much based on models, on old models. So I would think that's where I would start, and I would probably also look at immigration. I think that is an issue that needs to be mentioned even in polite conversation. I mean, there is a case for stricter or at least limits. I think there is a case for a ceiling, even for countries like Germany. And I can see Merkel's point when she says if there is a war in a neighboring country, we can't impose ceilings on fundamental human rights. I mean, I see there is a dilemma, but at the same time, societies can only absorb a certain number of refugees in any given year. And to have an influx of 1 million immigrants into Germany or refugees into Germany was simply too much. And in the UK, the problem was not the numbers, the arriving numbers in any one year, but it's the long stream of arrivals in conjunction with some problems in the economy, like in the housing market that cannot expand, so that the country was simply not prepared for this type of policy, that's the kind of thought one should put into this. So I'm not saying that Brexit was necessarily the right response. I didn't support it myself, but we can see why a country might choose to conclude that this is the response. And I think the Remain campaigners in the UK have reacted really badly after this. I mean, some have tried to there was this campaign to undo this referendum, which has really divided the groups into which has really also lessened their influence on policy. I don't think anyone in government will now want to cooperate with them. That was, I think, a strategic mistake. Instead of focusing on single market membership or customs union membership, they basically said, okay, we lost, we're sorry we lost, but now let's get a second best option going. That I thought was a mistake. So I think these are the things that I would have made difference, in addition to, in the EU in particular, to have a higher defense spending.
Yeah, and I think it's some of Karthik's agenda as well. I mean, the structural corruption. Don't have a 2008 financial crisis, and don't then pretend in a way that we just have to give it time and everything will be fine in the end, which is, I think, been too much of the European policy, but also to some large degree in the United States as well, really. Who else?
Stop going to Davos.
And stop going to Davos. Wolfgang and I gave up years ago. That's right. We are sensible. Now, one at the back and then one at the front. Yeah.
Tired of champagne.
Tired of champagne. Ah.
Hi, I would like to ask Professor Ramanna and the other guest speakers about the position of Japan and South Korea in the Asia Pacific with the rise of Trump and China, especially because Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was the first Prime Minister meeting President-elect Trump at that time. And then South Korea will very likely have a new president who might be Ban Ki-moon. So I'm interested to know the geopolitics in the Asia-Pacific region, especially with South Korea and Japan.
What do you think?
Yes, thanks for the question. It's a very good question. I think there is the potential by the end of 2017 for not an absolute realignment, but significant changes in terms of the relationships in the region. I don't actually believe that, despite the more extreme parts of his rhetoric, that President Trump is looking to tear up the entire network of U.S. alliances in East Asia, although you never know. But I think at this stage, we can't say that that's very likely to happen. But there is no doubt, I was just in Japan for about a week and talking to quite a few foreign policy people there just 2 weeks ago, that actually there are quite a lot of varied views on Trump. One view expressed by a quite senior policy person was that Trump was the best opportunity Japan had had in years to actually rethink its role and take up a leadership role in Asia. And actually, Shinzo Abe is quite well placed to do that because certainly compared to many other leaders, not just in Asia but elsewhere, he's very well placed. He's popular enough. There aren't many alternatives. He's changed the LDP so that actually the old faction system is much less varied than it was. And he can probably sit where he wants to be, barring some kind of great rupture till 2020, which gives him enough time to, at least, which gives him time to plan. Also, Japan's defense spending continues to be strong and to rise, so he's got a good basis on which to rethink Japan's role if it wants to do that. South Korea's situation, I think, is quite different because of the impeachment of President Park, which I think makes the prospect of a left president coming in at the next election more likely than would have been the case half a year ago before the scandal hit. And that means that if past precedent is anything to go by, a left leadership in South Korea is unlikely to break the relationship with the United States, the ROK-US Defense Alliance, but it is more likely to try and find accommodations with China. Even Park Geun-hye, I think, did that from a position of relative strength, but I think a left president would find that was a useful thing to do, partly because of continuing concerns about what's going to happen with the North Korea issue, and that's one of the things on which Trump hasn't said very much, but which many people think is likely to emerge as a problem in the region. So I think the answer to your question is that we will see some reorientations. I don't think a fundamental reorientation at this time, but I think that it's likely that Japan may choose to take a relatively stronger role in the region in the next year or so, but that China will also be able to find more opportunities to do what it's already done, which is to reorient significant numbers of the members of ASEAN in a pro-Chinese direction, and also, I think, try and build up a better relationship with the new South Korean administration to place itself well for whatever comes after that.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is just to mention Russia, to bring Russia into it. I mean, absolutely agree entirely with what Rana has said. It's a great opportunity for Shinzo Abe and for Japan in many ways. And one thing that it makes easier even is the building of or the reinforcing of a Japan-Russia relationship and using it as a balance to China, permitted, if you like, by Trump in the way that it might not have been permitted, as it were, by President Clinton.
And adding the oddity of if there is genuinely warming between Trump and Putin, whether or not that also changes the agenda.
It starts to open up all sorts of things. And but I do think also, though, it means Abe will push much harder on reforming Article 9 of the Constitution. His childhood
The word
dream.
reform covers so many things.
Exactly,
there,
it does.
absolutely.
It does.
Sure.
So, but microphone coming.
Was going to raise. We haven't said much about Russia, Syria, the wider Middle East, and it strikes me that if we were here 7 months ago, just about before the 23rd June result, we would have seen that as really one of the primary geopolitical conundrums. And one of the things Trump said was, in addition to some positive things about Russia, was that he would was it destroy or defeat Islamic terrorism?
Yeah.
You know, but is there a way he could possibly claim to have done that if you took that as ISIS, which is declining anyway? He got together with Russia, did a deal with Russia's new best friend Turkey, formerly their enemy, and stopped worrying particularly about human rights and where his drones land by mistake. Probably not putting U.S. troops there in any great numbers, but maybe widening the special forces and so on, turning a blind eye to Turkey's beating up on the Kurds and so on, and build some or contribute to, be able to claim that when ISIS was diminished there, he did it all.
Well, certainly that last part is, I think, a guarantee that he would he would seek to do that. I must say. I mean, we don't have a specialist on this on the panel, but I mean, I would agree with you that at some point that's going to be some of his agenda. I think that his people, his advisors, will just caution him a bit to not overclaim just because of the inability to do similar operations in Libya or in Nigeria or in other areas of importance for Islamic terrorism. So although overclaiming is not something he's usually reluctant to do, nevertheless, that, I guess, is what Tillerson and others will probably try to do. But I mean, that's where the U.S., Russia, and then a rapprochement with Turkey starts to lead, of course, absolutely. It's consequences of it for Europe that perhaps are maybe something we could just explore briefly. For sanctions, for Merkel, how important does that look?
I think one the key position for Europe on sanctions will be France, and that France, it looks like, unless Macron were to win the French elections, which is possible, that the majority in favor of Merkel's position will crumble. And it will be very hard for Merkel to maintain the position if the Americans don't maintain the position. It's just physically very difficult, because obviously if you cannot, this thing works because it's, if you wanted to invest in Russia, you can't do it because there isn't a stock market where you can transact. There's just no way to do this. But obviously if America ends the sanctions, for the Europeans to keep it up would be physically very difficult to do, and the majorities would change as well. So my guess, it will end. It will end fairly soon. Trump said, and I would trust him on that. I think the difficulty will come over if he clashes with Putin over something else. But I think in the initial phases, that's one of the things where I believe, where I take him literally and seriously, that he would actually get a deal done with Putin on sanctions. It's the kind of thing he will do, and he's never been behind that policy of sanctions. It's anti-business, and the business lobby is going against it. That's going to happen. He will ask for a price. He's a transactional guy, so that there may be some nuclear treaty. I'm not an expert on this in particular, but I would be very surprised if that took a year or so. I mean, I would expect that to happen this year.
But as you say, the European support is bound to come. I mean, the Italians would be.
Italians already
don't want it.
They're weak. They're just basically not rising and prioritizing it. But the Italian position has always been pro-Russian. The French position in the election campaign, of the three most likely or most promising contestants, two are quite pro-Trump. That's Fillon and Le Pen. While Macron would be supporting the German position, so that's quite interesting in that context.
Just briefly, I think domestically, one question that we have yet to answer, and which I don't have the answer to, but is with Trump getting rid of so many of the Obama people who've been doing this anti-terrorism work for the last 8 years, it remains to be seen what the ideology is going to be in terms of fighting terrorism. And I think that we really don't know the answer to that yet. But he said, I will defeat ISIS, and he has not put anything forward about how he might do that. So I think that will be a big piece of this puzzle.
It would be quite surprising if it was an early priority,
Yeah.
wouldn't it? I mean, really, given events, of course, come along and force it to be. But any final question? Because I'm running out of time. But there we are. We're in the middle there. One final contribution.
Thank you very much for the discussion. And I would like to ask Mr. Ramanna, you have brought up the distinction between pro-market policy and pro-business policy, implying that Mr. Trump's motivation could be largely economic. And this is a really interesting question to me, being from the Czech Republic, where we are heading for elections later this year, with the second richest man very likely going to win and becoming a prime minister, and having ownership of large part of the media sector and agriculture sector. Of course, his motivation is a concern for many people. And is it economic, or is it rather like genuine motivation for power? And I'm wondering, maybe a question to all of you, is it even important to understand this distinction, if Trump's motivation is rather economic, or is it for power? And if so, are there any tellings in his action already what his motivation truly could be? Because, I mean, his effort to lower taxes, for example, could also be motivated by his effort to swing the old guard capitalists to his side. So it doesn't necessarily have to imply that his motivation is his own business, right?
Right, and the precursor is Berlusconi, the model for your Czech candidate. And Berlusconi did nothing for the economy, but he did a lot for his businesses. So
thank you. That's a good point.
Karthik.
Even if Trump focuses exclusively on his own interests, which I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case, there will be some positive spillover effects to the economy. And I think, the U.S. tax system is an absolute mess. U.S. corporate tax rate is 35%, which is 10% above the OECD average. That's unsustainable. U.S. has this peculiar rule about where you don't pay your tax unless you repatriate it. And so that has resulted in, trillions of dollars of U.S. corporate income sitting overseas. And that money has to be repatriated at some point. I think that, and it's in Trump's interest and it's in the business interest to see that those kinds of legislations pass. And if you have an injection of $3 trillion of capital into the U.S. economy, that's going to do some good. So, there will be some positive spillover from that. So, again, I'd say we have to fix the tax system. This is, Obama tried for 8 years, wasn't able to get it done. Here comes along Trump. He might quite be able to do something about it, and we will see a substantial injection of capital in the U.S. economy. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, so pro-business and pro-market are different, but aren't always in contradiction with one another.
Precisely.
That's the point. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, I'm going to close here because I've run over time, but thank you all four of you for a wonderful discussion. Into crystal ball land, I admit, but it's a broad field, but this is what's going to shape our coming several years, shall we say, understating it in a strong way. So I want to have you thank all members of the panel very warmly. Thank you. And in this What's in the News session, we return in 2 weeks' time to look at the forgotten crisis of Yemen, actually the war in Yemen. And therefore Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UK, and others involved. Thank you. Come again.
Lovely.